closing ad expressed outrage at Wall Street, quote, controlling the levers of power in Washington. And it pictured Goldman Sachs CEO Lloyd Blankfein as part of, quote, the global special interests that were rigging the economy against working families. Then Trump won, and within days hired and nominated enough Goldman Sachs alumni to open a new bank branch in the White House. His senior strategist, Steve Bannon, spent half a decade at Goldman Sachs as an investment banker. His National Economic Council director, Gary Cohn, came directly from Goldman Sachs, where he spent 25 years and rose to be second in command at the bank. His senior counselor for economic initiatives, Dina Powell, came directly from Goldman Sachs, where she's been a partner since 2010. Finally, Donald Trump nominated Steve Mnuchin to serve as his Secretary of Treasury. Mr. Mnuchin spent 17 years at Goldman Sachs, much of it in the division that created and peddled the kinds of mortgage-backed securities that would later blow up the financial system. Personnel is policy. The selection of all of these Goldman Sachs executives to serve as core members of Trump's economic team shows that the president has no interest in reducing Wall Street's influence in Washington and leveling the playing field for working families. Instead, it will be the same Republican playbook, gutting the rules for big banks, firing the cops on Wall Street, the same playbook that paved the way for the 2008 financial crisis. But even among the group of Goldman Sachs bankers surrounding the president, the selection of Mr. Mnuchin as Treasury Secretary, it stands out. The Treasury Secretary leads the council responsible for making sure Wall Street doesn't blow up our economy again. And the council can't do anything without the support of the Treasury Secretary. No other official has greater responsibility to stand up to Wall Street if they threaten the economy again. And yet, there is nothing in Mr. Mnuchin's record to suggest that he could stand up to Wall Street. In fact, there is nothing in Mr. Mnuchin's record to suggest that he would even want to stand up to Wall Street, that he's even thought of standing up to Wall Street. Mr. Mnuchin is the ultimate Wall Street insider. From the moment he graduated from college until today, he has worked at a big bank or a hedge fund. If Wall Street threatens to blow up the economy again, does anyone seriously expect Mr. Mnuchin to get tough with his old buddies and tell him to knock it off? In fact, you can expect just the opposite. Mr. Mnuchin pretty much laps the field when it comes to personal experience in tilting the playing field in favor of financial interests and against working families. In late 2008, as the financial crisis was sweeping across the country, Mr. Mnuchin led a team of millionaires to purchase IndyMac Bank out of federal receivership. He rebranded the bank as One West and put himself in charge as CEO. And then Mr. Mnuchin and One West acted swiftly and decisively to boot more than 60,000 families out of their homes across the country. Look, I get it. Foreclosures happen in an economic crisis. But One West, Mr. Mnuchin's bank, was different. It quickly gained a reputation as a foreclosure machine, both because it was so aggressive at foreclosing on families and because the bank hardly did anything else. Countless homeowners who were trapped by a One West mortgage had their lives turned upside down. Some ended up homeless. How sleazy and out of line was Mr. Mnuchin's bank? Well, the bank paid millions of dollars to settle lawsuits for predatory foreclosure practices. They were so sleazy that they even got hit with almost $3 million in fines for violating the rights of dozens of active duty service members. You really have to ask, what kind of a man does something like that? Cheats our soldiers while they're on active duty? The model Mr. Mnuchin developed for One West was terrible for homeowners, but it was fabulous for him. 6 years after buying the bank, he sold it and reportedly pocketed as much as $200 million in personal profits. $200 million for 6 years of throwing families out of their homes. Wow, only on Wall Street. Mr. Mnuchin's leadership of One West is critical to evaluating his fitness to serve as Treasury Secretary. And that's why I joined 24 other Democratic senators in asking Chairman Hatch of the Senate Finance Committee to include some of Mr. Mnuchin's foreclosure victims as witnesses at Mr. Mnuchin's hearing. The chairman refused. So Democrats invited some of those homeowners to come to the Senate anyway to share their stories at a forum. We invited every senator, Democrat or Republican, to attend the forum. We also invited Mr. Mnuchin to attend. Not one single Republican showed up, not one. And Mr. Mnuchin refused to attend. But Senate Democrats turned out to listen, and the stories that we heard will break your heart. We heard from Colleen Eisenhodroff from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Colleen is 84 years old. She and her husband, Monroe, got a reverse mortgage on their fully paid off home from Financial Freedom, which is a One West subsidiary. At the time, the broker assured them that Colleen could keep living in her home even if her husband passed away before she did. But just days after Monroe's funeral, Mr. Mnuchin's bank told her she needed to pay off the entire loan or face foreclosure. She's been fighting them off for 2 years now, but the threat hangs over her and her family. Sylvia Oliver from Scotch Plains, New Jersey, also told us her story. She had been trying for years to get a loan modification from One West, and for years, the bank refused to work with her in good faith. Sylvia choked up as she described how she felt when her young daughter told her, "Mom, I love our home." And she had to smile and look her daughter in the eyes, not knowing whether they could keep that home for more than even a few more weeks. We heard from Christina Clifford from Carlsbad, California. Christina, and she is a real go-getter, a self-employed small business owner who saved up enough money to buy her first home soon after she turned 20. When the financial crisis hit, the income from her business dried up, and she reached out to Mr. Mnuchin's bank for a modification. But when she sent in her modification paperwork, along with the check for her first new payment, sent them in a single envelope, Mr. Mnuchin's bank claimed they had never received the paperwork, even though they cashed the check that was in the same envelope. Ultimately, Mr. Mnuchin's bank foreclosed on Christina just days after an employee personally had assured her that she could still work out a modification to keep her home. But she lost her home. We also heard from Heather McCreary, a mother of twin boys from Sparks, Nevada. Like a lot of families, Heather and her husband Jack were hit hard by the financial crisis. She lost her job as a home health aide, and Jack, who worked construction, got fewer hours and lower wages. Heather and Jack applied to One West for a modification. They did everything they were told, but it didn't matter to Mr. Mnuchin and his friends at One West. The bank strung them along for years, and then, in the blink of an eye, foreclosed so abruptly that it literally put Heather, her husband Jack, and their twin boys out on the street. All four of these women begged the Senate to reject Mr. Mnuchin's nomination. Heather said, "Putting Steve Mnuchin in charge of the country's financial system is an insult to families like mine. Families who worked hard and did everything they could to get by after the economy collapsed. Take it from my experience. I know he will not be looking out for working people. Instead, he will use his position to make the economy work better for people like himself." no track record of independence from Wall Street, a history of profiting off the financial crisis by squeezing working families to the breaking point. Each one of these should be disqualifying to serve as Treasury Secretary. And that should be the end of his nomination. We should be done with this. But there's more. During Mr. Mnuchin's nomination process, he flat out lied to the Senate. Senator Casey from Pennsylvania asked Mr. Mnuchin a straightforward, factual question about foreclosure abuses at One West, and Mr. Mnuchin claimed they didn't happen. That's not even a good lie. Within days, reporters found court documents contradicting Mr. Mnuchin's claim. You know, something like that, this shouldn't be a partisan issue. A person who lies to Congress shouldn't be the country's top economic official, period. Done. But when Senate Democrats demanded that Mr. Mnuchin come before the Finance Committee again to account for his statements, Republicans on the committee unilaterally changed the rules and rammed Mr. Mnuchin's nomination through without a single Democrat present. Do Senate Republicans care about Mr. Mnuchin's lies? The American people should. If Mr. Mnuchin is willing to lie about something that is so easily disproven by public court documents, what else is he willing to lie about? How can Congress or the American people believe him ever again? We know Mr. Mnuchin has the full support of Wall Street. The big bank lobbyists and Mr. Mnuchin's hedge fund pals, man, they want to see him confirmed. They are lobbying hard. They know he will help out his old buddies and give them all the financial rule rollbacks and sweetheart deals that they want. And what we know is that's usually enough to carry the day around here. But me, I'm going with Colleen and Heather and Sylvia and Christina. I heard what Mr. Mnuchin and his bank did to them and to thousands more like them in Massachusetts and all across the country. And the United States Senate should not reward that kind of sleazy, cruel, and sometimes illegal conduct by making him the Secretary of Treasury. We cannot say to the millions of people who lost their homes, who lost their jobs, who lost their savings during the financial crisis, that a man like Mr. Mnuchin will be entrusted with the keys to our Treasury. We cannot say to the American people that someone who lied to Congress, who lied and didn't even have to come back and explain his lie, can become a senior cabinet official. A lot of people believed Donald Trump when he said he would be tough on Wall Street. A lot of people voted for him because of that promise. By hiring half of Goldman Sachs to run the economy, Donald Trump has made clear he has no intention of keeping his promise. And now, with the vote on Mr. Mnuchin, the American public will have the chance to see whether Senate Republicans are serious about keeping Wall Street in line, too. Don't hold your breath, America. I will be voting no on Mr. Mnuchin's nomination, and I urge all of my colleagues to do the same. But I want to read some of the stories that we have about Mr. Mnuchin's time at One West. Now, you don't have to take this just from me. I may be the one speaking here tonight, but it is the voices of Colleen and Heather and Sylvia and Christina and thousands of others whose lives were ruined by Steve Mnuchin's aggressive foreclosure tactics that really deserve to be heard. I already told you about Colleen Eisenhodroth, the 84-year-old woman who is getting cheated out of her home that she lived in for over 50 years and that was fully paid off, getting cheated out of that home by Steve Mnuchin's bank. And now what I'd like to do is share her full story in her own words. This is what she had to say. My name is Colleen Eisenhodroth. I am 84 years old. I am a resident of Minneapolis, Minnesota. My husband, Monroe Hodruff, and I purchased our home located at 2753 Ewing Avenue in 1963 as a home for our family of 6 children. They called us the Brady Bunch of Ewing Avenue. Our house was the heart and soul of our family. Monroe and I were married for 55 years, and we successfully ran 4 small grocery stores. I would like to thank you all very much for allowing me to share my story. I am here today because Financial Freedom, my reverse mortgage servicer, is trying to foreclose on my home. This is despite the fact that when my husband Monroe and I took out this loan, they told us that I could remain in the home if Monroe should die before me. In July of 2006, my husband and I decided to take out a reverse mortgage with Financial Freedom. It was a very complicated process. Someone came to our house, and I was asked to sign a number of papers. Usually, Monroe handled the financial matters for our household. We were told that I could live in the house if Monroe passed away. It was never Monroe's or my intention that the survivor of the 2 of us would have to sell the house or leave if one of us died. We would not have signed for the loan if we thought that was the case. My husband Monroe passed away on September 12, 2014. A mere 10 days later, despite what we had been told, Financial Freedom contacted me and told me that I needed to pay off the loan immediately. This was news to me. I was in no financial position to do so. Since then, Financial Freedom has been trying to foreclose on me. I think this is an injustice that an elderly woman was deceived, and now Financial Freedom is trying to take my home. Why would Financial Freedom do this to me? I relied on what I was told, and now they are trying to kick me out of our family home. How was I supposed to know if what I was told wasn't true? What am I supposed to do now? My understanding is that in such circumstances, Financial Freedom blames HUD for it kicking out non-borrowing spouses. Experts who have reviewed my paperwork have told me that this isn't even a HUD-backed loan. So Financial Freedom has no one to blame but themselves. It seems Financial Freedom should be working to keep people like me in their homes, not fighting to kick us out. I hear that Steve Mnuchin was a leader of the bank that is doing this to me and other seniors. I do not think a man like that should be the Treasury Secretary and in charge of our economy. We can't let that happen. Thank you again for allowing me to tell my story on behalf of those who have had bad dealings with Financial Freedom and One West. Thank you, Colleen. I appreciate your telling your story. I also talked about Heather McCreary, her husband, and her twin boys, and how her family was left out on the street because of the greed of Steve Mnuchin and One West Bank. Heather courageously shared her story with us, and here's what she said. My name is Heather McCreary. My husband, Jack, and my 2 kids, Jaden and Clara, and I, are from Sparks, Nevada. This is my story about how my family's American dream turned into a nightmare. I'm sharing my story with the hope of explaining why we cannot let Steve Mnuchin become Secretary of the Treasury. Putting Steve Mnuchin in charge of the Treasury Department would mean that a man who profited off the struggles of families like mine would be one of the most powerful people in the U.S. economy. For a while, it was looking like our shot at the American dream was going pretty well. In 2006, Jack and I bought our dream home in Sparks, just a mile away from my parents and a short walk to Jaden and Clara's school and to parks that the kids could play in. I was working as a home health care worker and Jack was working in construction. And together, we were managing just fine. Then, In 2008, when the economy started to get worse, I was laid off. The following year, in 2009, Jack was laid off too. Though Jack was able to find another job pretty fast, he had to take a big pay cut from about $25 an hour to $8.50 an hour. Between the cut in Jack's pay and the loss in income I experienced when going on unemployment insurance benefits after I got laid off, we were pinched and we were drowning financially. However, we were determined to keep our dream home. So Jack and I were tenacious about doing whatever we could to get help. We sought help from the New Hope Alliance, which is an alliance of HUD-approved counselors who provide free foreclosure help, and from the Washoe County Senior Law Project. We worked side by side with both organizations to do everything required of us by our mortgage servicer, IndyMac, which later became One West. When we first asked for help, One West gave us a short forbearance and allowed us to make a smaller payment for several months with the goal of a reduction in our monthly mortgage payments through the Home Affordable Modification Program, or HAMP. By applying for the HAMP program, we thought we were back on the road to keeping our home. We complied 100% with One West's requirements for HAMP. We were incredibly nervous about being able to keep our home, so we were extremely careful to make sure we did everything we could to keep the process going forward. Our application for HAMP was processed, and we were approved for a modification. I sent in the signed paperwork and the first payment under the modified payment amount. But then the process started to fall apart. After a whole 30 days, One West returned our personal check and told us that only certified checks would be accepted. So they were now voiding the modification offer. We had followed the instructions to the letter on One West's paperwork, crossing our T's and dotting our I's. But in the end, this didn't matter, and One West's rejection of our HAMP application put us on the road to foreclosure. We applied 2 more times for loan modifications over the next 6 months because we were given assurances by people at One West that they would approve our application. We again complied with every request One West made of us, taking care to send in extra documents whenever One West requested them. But as far as I can tell, One West never attempted to process the loan modification. The foreclosure went through, and we lost our home on September 10th, 2010. The foreclosure left us without a home, and finding new rental was extremely difficult because of our credit. Juggling the demands of raising our twins, and this was so hard. The foreclosure even meant that our kids had to miss school. Eventually, we did find a new place, but we had to pay outrageous rent, even though it was not a good home for us at all. It's hard to explain the shame, embarrassment, and grief that Jack and I felt. I've cried a river of tears over this. I really didn't think we were asking for too much. We wanted to hang on to our home for the sake of our kids, and we did everything we could to stay in our home. And while I will probably never know exactly what One West did, the outcome of my story proves that Steve Mnuchin's company had no interest in helping us. They wanted to foreclose because they were focused on their profits. Putting Steve Mnuchin in charge of the country's financial system is an insult to families like mine, families who worked hard and did everything they could to get by after the economy collapsed. Take it from my experience. I know he will not be looking out for working people. Instead, he will use his position to make the economy work better for people like himself. On behalf of my family and others like it, I ask you to please reject Steve Mnuchin as Treasury Secretary. Thank you, Heather, for sending in your letter. I appreciate it. And remember Sylvia. She and her family are facing foreclosure later this month. Yet she came all the way to Washington to stop the Senate from putting Steve Mnuchin in a position to harm millions of others. Sylvia told us her story, and this is what she said. My name is Sylvia Oliver, and I am a homeowner from Scotch Plains, New Jersey. I got my mortgage from IndyMac in May 2008, and about a month later, IndyMac failed. I want to share my story because it is more than a house. It is a home for me, my husband and my 3 children and my grandchildren. In early 2009, my husband and I were facing financial difficulties. Because of the economy being in bad shape, my husband was between jobs. We reached out to One West to request a modification. We were told that we had to make 3 payments in order to move forward on a permanent modification. So we made those 3 payments. After making those payments, I reached back out to One West to find out what the next steps were. But I couldn't get a straight answer from them. So we continued making partial payments, even though it was a challenge for us financially. In February 2010, I submitted a modification application to One West Bank. About 6 weeks later, I received a notice of intent to foreclose. However, the person I'd been talking to at One West, a man named Albert, told me not to worry and encouraged me to continue submitting updated documents to the bank. So for the next year, I would submit new documents to the bank through FedEx and through faxes, and every week I would call Albert and ask him if he had an update on my situation. And every week he would tell me there was no answer and to call back the next week. After a year of my weekly phone calls, I finally received a denial letter from One West in February 2011 when they said they couldn't modify my loan. Albert at One West told me I could reapply for a modification, which I did because I really wanted to keep our home. For the next several months, the cycle would repeat, and with the bank telling me to reapply for a modification, me believing they were sincere, and then a few months later, being told that we had been declined again. This was surprising because during this time, we were back on our feet and our incomes were both increasing, which meant we were in a better position to pay for our mortgage. At the end of 2015, I received another notice of foreclosure from the bank. At this point, it became clear to me that One West never had any intention of modifying the loan in such a way that they would still get paid back and we would be able to keep our home. In March of 2016, I hired a lawyer because I thought they might have more success in working with the bank than I did. At my attorney's advice, I filed a Chapter 13 bankruptcy as part of another modification application. That process went on for about 5 or 6 months with the same cycle of me sending paperwork over and over to the bank and the same answer again. Last year, I was facing foreclosure 3 weeks before Christmas. However, that was then postponed until this month. In fact, I was supposed to be foreclosed on by One West today. That's the day she came to Washington. However, after Senator Menendez's office called One West, I learned that my sale had been postponed at least until next month. Earlier this month, I sought help from a HUD-approved housing counselor. She worked with me and my husband to document our income and to submit a modification application. After analyzing our situation, she was surprised to hear that we had not qualified for a modification earlier, especially since my husband and I both have good incomes. As of right now, I'm still facing foreclosure next month. That would be February. And I know in my heart that this is because of One West's only intent was to foreclose on my home. This bank has had ample opportunities to modify my loan. In fact, they told me that they own the loan. So I know they can't blame this situation on an investor not allowing them to modify my loan. Nobody should have to go through the experience that I've gone through during the past several years with One West Bank. It's been very painful and stressful not knowing if my kids and my family are going to have a home to live in or if it's going to be foreclosed on. I would ask you to remember my experience when you consider whether Mr. Mnuchin is qualified to lead the Department of the Treasury. As the CEO and chair of One West Bank, Mr. Mnuchin had the opportunity to help families like mine with responsible loan modifications, and he didn't. I don't think this is a track record that anybody should be proud of. Thank you, Sylvia, for telling your story. And then there's Christina, a small business owner who owned her own home at the age of 20. I already told you about how Steve Mnuchin's bank ran her in circles until they could foreclose on her house. But now I want you to hear the full story from Christina. Here's what she said. Good afternoon. My name is Christina Clifford. I am hoping that by sharing my story with you today, I can explain why I believe confirming Steve Mnuchin for Treasury Secretary would be a serious mistake for our country. I experienced firsthand what it was like to be subject to One West greed, and I can tell you that the person who ran One West Bank should not be the person responsible for oversight of the U.S. economy. In 2001, when I was 20, I bought my first home, a great condo in Whittier, California, just outside Los Angeles. I was young, but I've always been a motivated self-starter. I am also a self-employed small business owner, my primary source of income. Things were going just fine, and I was never, ever late on my mortgage payments. However, that changed in 2008, like it did for so many of us when the economy took a turn for the worse. My business struggled, and I started relying on credit cards to stay afloat. In March of 2009, I was unable to make my mortgage payment for the first time in 8 years as a homeowner. I called One West directly to see what options I would have for keeping my home. They told me flat out that because I had never been delinquent, they had no way of helping me. In order to get help, they said, I would have to fall behind on my payments. Of course, this was misleading, and I've since found out a common tactic that mortgage lenders use to push people into default. From there, I began the long process of loan modification through the Home Affordable Mortgage Program, or HAMP. I sent in numerous documents to One West, and in May, I was offered my first loan modification. I was thrilled. The new payments would fit perfectly in my budget, so I signed the loan modification papers and sent them via FedEx, along with a check for my first payment under the new modified payment amount. In July, I expected One West to send me a statement with the new lower payment amount. Instead, I received a letter saying that they had not received my loan modification paperwork, so the modification terms were no longer valid. I called them, and One West confirmed that they had not received my return loan modification agreement. I knew right away this wasn't right, because they had cashed the check for the first modified payment that was in the same FedEx envelope. That they managed to cash the check but completely neglect the loan modification agreement, again, in the same envelope, is absolutely outrageous. I had no choice but to apply again, this time submitting even more documents. I was told to submit and resubmit many duplicative documents in many different formats. Despite how difficult One West made the process, I did everything they asked because I was determined to keep my home. On August 3rd, 2009, I received a notice of default from One West, but proceeded with my second attempt at modifying my loan. I received my second loan modification offer later that month. The terms were almost identical to the offer they made me in May, so I quickly signed the offer and mailed it in with another check. In October, I got a letter exactly like the one I received earlier, saying that they had not received the loan modification paperwork and the modification offer was no longer valid. Yet, as they did the first time, they cashed the check I sent in with the signed offer. At that point, I felt I had no choice but to get an attorney who worked to get my foreclosure postponed while the loan modification process played out. He spoke with the people at One West, who told him they would postpone the sale of my condo until the loan modification process was completed. This simply wasn't true. On the evening of December 3rd, 2009, I received a knock on my door from a man that introduced himself as the new owner of my property. And in March of 2010, I received a final notice telling me that I had 5 days to leave my apartment, 5 days to pack up the 10 years of my life that I had spent in my home. The reason I'm sharing my story is because there are so many other people out there like me who got left in the dust. Steve Mnuchin profited from people like me, even when we did everything we could to keep our homes. You might say that Steve Mnuchin did not personally authorize One West to cheat me out of my home, but his fortune rose as a direct result of managing a company that routinely engaged in irresponsible behavior. The Treasury Secretary will be tasked with making sure that the American economy is working in a way that benefits all of Americans, not just the top 1%. However, Steve Mnuchin is not that person. He is just the opposite. Please make a statement for people like me and oppose his confirmation as Treasury Secretary. Thank you, Christina. Thank you for coming to Washington. Thank you for submitting your story. Now, these are just 4 stories, 4 experiences among the thousands more like them, all leading to the same simple but startling conclusion. Under Steve Mnuchin's leadership, One West Bank took advantage of homeowners all across the country in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis. And why did they do it? They did it to make a quick buck. But don't just take my word for it. Paulina Gonzalez, the executive director for the California Reinvestment Coalition, also came to Washington to speak to us. Paulina and her organization have been closely tracking One West's destructive practices for years. And here's what Paulina told us. My name is Paulina Gonzalez. I am the executive director of the California Reinvestment Coalition. Over the past 30 years, CRC has grown to the largest state reinvestment coalition in the country, with a membership of 300 organizations that serve low-income communities and communities of color. It is critically important that our elected representatives and the American public hear directly from people who have lost their homes due to the egregious practices and abuses by One West under Mr. Mnuchin's leadership before deciding on his nomination to the high and important office of Treasury Secretary. I'm going to share some data and information with you in the next few minutes, but know that the wreckage from One West is not really about numbers, data, and legal briefs. It's about the tens of thousands of Americans who have suffered devastating financial and personal losses as a result of One West's abusive foreclosure practices. Whether it's the story of the Minnesota woman who sought a loan modification from One West and returned to her home in a blizzard only to find that her locks were changed, or the 90-year-old woman who was nearly kicked out of her home for mistakenly paying 27 cents less than the amount One West said she owed, or the 80-year-old former Christian missionary who was notified at his home that Financial Freedom was foreclosing on him because the bank said they had no record of him living there. The issue is the same. Instead of helping people stay in their homes, Mr. Mnuchin devised a foreclosure machine that used every trick in the book to profit from their suffering. and foreclose he did. CRC and Urban Strategies Council analyzed data showing that One West foreclosed on over 36,000 families in California and 24,000 families nationally. All of these foreclosures occurred after Mr. Mnuchin purchased IndyMac Bank. In addition, we suspect that One West's reverse mortgage subsidiary, Financial Freedom, has foreclosed on more seniors, widows, widowers, and heirs than any other company participating in the federal home equity conversion mortgage program. A Freedom of Information Act request that we filed with HUD revealed that Financial Freedom had foreclosed on over 16,000 seniors, widows, widowers, and their families, or 39% of all home equity conversion mortgage foreclosures, roughly twice the rate one would expect given the bank's market share. I just want to say that one more time. They foreclosed on seniors, on widows, on widowers, on families at about twice the rate of anyone else doing the same business. Mr. Mnuchin may defend his record by saying he inherited these bad loans, that the foreclosures were inevitable, that his bank followed the law in dealing with his customers. We strongly disagree, and it appears we are not alone. In a CNN story that aired on January 3rd about Mr. Mnuchin and Financial Freedom, a HUD spokesperson was quoted as saying, quote, "While HUD doesn't dispute that it has strict rules for government-backed reverse mortgages, One West had the ability to give survivors more time, but chose not to." Mr. Mnuchin's spokespeople have also praised his modification record, but we are not sure there is much to praise. 2013 data from the Treasury Department shows that One West had among the highest denial rates for the Home Affordable Modification Program, the federal government's main foreclosure prevention effort, HAMP. Under Mr. Mnuchin, One West denied 3/4 of the thousands of loan modification requests that came in from families trying to save their homes. One West was much more likely to deny loan modifications under this program than its peers, such as Bank of America or Wells Fargo. A January 2013 memo from the California Attorney General's office revealed a staff investigation finding of, quote, widespread misconduct at the bank, including backdating thousands of foreclosure documents, improper foreclosure auction credit bidding, which meant the bank could claim tax exemptions that it wasn't entitled to, proceeding with foreclosures without the proper authority to do so, and speeding up foreclosure timelines. All of these practices deprived working families in California a fair chance to stay in their homes. The Treasury Secretary leads our economy. The Secretary helps oversee our banking system and will have much to say about important policies relating to banking, housing, and economic development that will impact all Americans. The country needs a Treasury Secretary who will consider the needs of all Americans, including working-class Americans. Mr. Mnuchin's tenure at One West Bank shows him to work in his interest and in the corporate interest at the great expense and harm to everyday Americans. Thank you, Paulina. I appreciate your sending in this information, and I agree. Unfortunately, Mr. Mnuchin's history of oppressive foreclosure practices isn't the only thing that disqualifies him from serving as Secretary of the Treasury. I already told you that Mr. Mnuchin flat out lied to the Senate when he told my colleague, Senator Casey, that his bank didn't engage in certain foreclosure practices. I'd like to share an article from the Columbus Dispatch uncovering the exact practices that Mr. Mnuchin told the United States Senate that his bank never engaged in. Here's what the article says. President Donald Trump's nominee for U.S. Secretary of the Treasury was untruthful with the Senate during the confirmation process, documents uncovered by the Dispatch show. Steve Mnuchin, former chairman and chief executive officer of One West Bank, known for its aggressive foreclosure practices, flatly denied in testimony before the Senate Finance Committee that One West used robo-signing on mortgage documents. But records show the bank utilized the questionable practice in Ohio. Quote, "The guy is just lying. There's no other way to say it," said Bill Faith, executive director of the Coalition on Homelessness and Housing in Ohio. The revelation comes with the committee's vote on whether to confirm Mnuchin's nomination, currently scheduled for Monday night. Robo-signing is the informal term for when a mortgage company employee signs hundreds of foreclosures, swearing they have scrutinized the document as required by law, when in fact they have not. One West Bank did not robo-sign documents, Mnuchin said in response to questions from individual senators, and as the only bank to successfully complete the independent foreclosure review required by the federal banking regulators to investigate allegations of robo-signing, I am proud of our institution's extremely low error rate. I just want to read that one more time. Steve Mnuchin said One West Bank did not robo-sign documents, and he's proud of what he did. But a Dispatch analysis of nearly 4 foreclosure cases filed by One West in Franklin County in 2010 alone shows that the company frequently used robo-signers. The vast majority of the Columbus area cases were signed by 11 different people in Travis County, Texas. Those employees call themselves vice presidents, assistant vice presidents, managers, and assistant secretaries. In 3 local cases, a judge dismissed One West foreclosure proceedings specifically based on inaccurate robo-signings. The Dispatch found more than 1,900 One West foreclosures in the state's 6 largest counties from 2009 to 2015. Carla Duncan, a social worker from Cleveland Heights, was snared by One West's robo-signing machinery. On her way out of town for a short trip in 2010, Duncan stopped by her home to get her mail and found a note from a field inspector for her mortgage company saying that her house was vacant and was going to be boarded up. It wasn't vacant. I was living there, Duncan said. There were curtains on the windows, the radio was playing, and the dog was there. What Duncan didn't know at the time was that One West had begun foreclosure proceedings on her 3-bedroom home, even though she was up to date on her payments. One West refused to accept a loan modification approved by a previous lender that had been purchased by One West, and it wanted to substantially increase Duncan's interest rate and monthly payment and add late fees. The company also put a lockbox on a separate rental property she owned in Cleveland. After hiring former Attorney General Mark Dan, waging a 5-year court battle, and filing personal bankruptcy, Duncan was finally able to get the foreclosures dismissed and keep her home and rental property. She said the experience was devastating. It got to the point I was afraid to open my own door. Court records show that Duncan's mortgage was robo-signed by Erica Johnson-Seck, Vice President of One West Department of Bankruptcy and Foreclosures. From her office in Austin, Texas, Johnson-Seck robo-signed an average of 750 foreclosure documents a week, according to a sworn deposition she gave in a Florida case in July 2009. Under oath, Johnson-Seck acknowledged that she did not read the document she was signing, taking only about 30 seconds to sign her name. To speed up the process, Johnson-Seck said she shortened her first name in her signature to just E. She said in the deposition that One West practice was to review about just 10% of the foreclosure documents for accuracy. Dan who now specializes in representing clients who have problems with banks and other lenders after he was forced to resign as Attorney General nearly 10 years ago, said Mnuchin's businesses were a, quote, major offender in problem mortgages. Dan said Mnuchin's firms were known for dual tracking, which means pursuing foreclosure simultaneously as they allegedly worked with homeowners, fabricating documents, and other tactics that caused unbelievable devastation in people's lives. In 2010, federal laws were changed, enabling borrowers victimized by lenders to sue them. Dan said he worries that Mnuchin, as Treasury Secretary, would quietly work to repeal reforms, collectively known as Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. That appears to be the case. It has been over 6 years since the passage of Dodd-Frank, and it seems like an appropriate time to review all of the regulations from Dodd-Frank to understand their impact on the market, investors, small businesses, and economic growth, Mnuchin said in a written answer to the Senate. The dispatch analysis showed thousands of Ohio homeowners, including 245 in Franklin County, found themselves in One West's crosshairs when they defaulted on their loans, the majority of them with high interest rates. Many mortgages had terms that housing and financial experts view as predatory: prepayment penalties, interest-only loans, and no-money down loans. Mnuchin was labeled by critics at the time as the foreclosure king. That's it, the foreclosure king. That's who is just hours away from becoming the chief financial officer of our country. Steve Mnuchin is a Wall Street insider who has spent his career looking out for himself and his billionaire buddies. He led a bank that forced thousands of hardworking Americans out of their homes, and he lied to the United States Senate. The Constitution demands that senators advise and consent on the president's nominations. Well, here is my advice. Steve Mnuchin is not fit to be Secretary of Treasury. He will not look out for the millions of Americans still recovering from the recession, like Heather and Christina. He certainly won't defend the interests of middle-class families like the McCrearys and the Olivers. And I know he will not stand up to Wall Street and fight to protect the interests of all Americans. I urge my colleagues to oppose Mr. Mnuchin's nomination. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.